I'm a big fan of Warhammer 40,000. It's the miniature wargame that I play the most, and it is a lot of fun, but it's a lot of mental work. I mean, a typical interaction might be some intercessors shooting, where you got 20 shots, hitting on 3 is gonna convert to about 13, but then you get to reroll hits, so that bumps it up to 18. 6s are lethal, and you got to reroll those, so there's probably about 5 or 6 lethals in there, but you're wounding on 4s because it's Space Marines, so you end up with like 12 successes. Your opponent takes those 12 successes on their 3-up armor save, which converts to like 4 or 5, let's say, wounds going through, and so that ends up being about 2 dead models and a half. It's a lot of math, and you multiply that interaction by 100, and you got yourself a game of 40k. It's a lot of fun, but it does wear you out. I think that is why my second favorite wargame is a little skirmish game called Moonstone. Moonstone has no math. I got into Moonstone the same way I get into most miniature wargames, really wanting to try out the figures. And I found, after painting up this crew, the fairies, probably the furthest possible thing I could get from my usual Black Templar painting, that I really enjoyed it. I had a ton of fun painting up these characters, and now that I have enough to play with, I've discovered that the fairies are probably the hardest possible faction to play in Moonstone. They've got a lot of abilities and a lot of buffs, and even though there's no math, this is a very difficult crew to run. My fairies gave me a tasting of what Moonstone had to offer, but I decided I wanted something a little simpler to learn the game with, and that became my goblins. These guys are super fun to play with in game, and my crew is set up for the sole purpose of giving Ribald the Giant as many opportunities as possible to shoot his incredibly inaccurate cannon. I have been playing with this crew, and that has actually let me learn Moonstone pretty well, enough that I maybe even bought some more things. Having not quite finished either of my other Moonstone factions, I decided to pick up a third, and that is the nature-loving Followers of Lesh. This is the Satyr faction, and they're a little bit of an in-between. They're kind of fighty like the goblins, and kind of speedy like the fairies. I'll get to these guys eventually, but now that I've actually got a good grasp of the game Moonstone, I'm starting to lean back into my fairies. Moonstone is a skirmish game that's played model by model on a small board, and so you want a lot of terrain. I've been using the Whimsical Cottages and the Creeping Forest available on EonsOfBattle.com, and it works really well. But in the rules, there's actually rules for water features. Water features is not something that you see a lot in terrain, but in Moonstone, I feel like it would fit really well. Number one, there are rules for how to interact with water, and some characters kind of require it. Sinara the Mermaid has rules that trigger when she's around water features, and if there aren't any on the board, which they probably won't be, then she can spawn them in as tokens. It gets the job done, but it's not very elegant. And then there's also nautical themed characters like Seasick Stew. Now, how is Stew gonna be sick if there's no sea? Moonstone is a wonderful opportunity to try out some new things, and I want to try out some water features. This is our newest creation here at Eons of Battle, the Deadly Swamp Bits Pack. It's a series of fantasy terrain and bits to help set your miniatures in a perilous natural environment. There are some low rock walls for figures to take cover behind, spooky trees to block some line of sight, and the thing that turns these pieces into a swamp, the scattered terrain that can be arranged in circles to create some ponds, complete with lily pads. And there are also some small pieces of scattered terrain and bits to sprinkle onto bases to add some more texture to any fantasy setting. This terrain pack was designed by us and is available now at EonsOfBattle.com. I really want to create some nice water features for my terrain collection, and to make this happen, I grabbed some 0.8mm plastic sheets and played around with my bits, figuring out some pieces to make up each of my river edges. Once I found the shapes I liked, I took a picture to remind myself what pieces I used, and then I traced out the edge with a Sharpie, making marks on each intersection so I can put these pieces back down when it's finished. I used some scissors to cut out the plastic following my Sharpie marks, and I made one small pond and one big one. Movement is a big deal in Moonstone, with models only moving a few inches a turn, so this big old pond will be a major roadblock. Once I had my shapes, I used a Dremel with a grinding wheel to quickly knock down the edge of my plastic so it has a gentle slope. That's my plastic foot prepared. Collecting my bits, I began gluing them down with some super glue. They're already taking form. Now my eventual plan is to do a resin pour, and to make sure that it's successful, I made myself a batch of milliput and I squished it down into each junction. I put this down so that there's at least a small bump all along the perimeter, and I also put a little bit of milliput here and there to make the ground more uneven and natural looking. A ball-ended sculpting tool was a big help with this. Once that was done, I broke out the texture paste, Vallejo European Mud. This stuff is great for forests because in addition to sand, it also has little wooden particles, and I slobber this all over the ground to integrate the plastic into my scene. And on the inside of my ponds, I used a damp brush to push the texture paste up against the walls and wipe away the spills that got on my bits. All in all, a pretty simple operation, and if these two pieces work out, I could easily build a bunch more. My spooky ponds are looking spiffy, and I'm very excited to see how they interact with the game Moonstone. The most important part is the game's namesake, the Moonstones. These are represented as D4s, and at the start of the game, you just drop them on the battlefield, and wherever they land, those are your objectives, that's where they are, and the number that is facing up is how hard they are to dig up. And because of the way that these ponds are built, they could very easily trap a Moonstone. Now that is important because water features affect movement. Every model in Moonstone gets to move between 2 and 4 inches for free every turn, but they're not allowed to make those moves in water features. To move into water features, they have to use a step action. Your actions are all the things that you can do when you activate a miniature in Moonstone, and a step is 1 inch, and it costs 1 action. You could be fighting, you could be shooting, you could be casting spells, you could be doing all sorts of other chicanery, but instead, you're kind of wasting your activation, just moving a little bit. This action economy is incredibly important, and what makes Moonstone so genius is this is how they balance the game. Even though you might be a regular human or a skeleton or a ghost or a goblin or a little fairy, all of the models are balanced against one another because of the energy that they have. When they activate, that determines what they can do in a turn. Big powerful Ribald and his big old cannon only gets 2 energy, 2 actions that they can take during a turn. That could be just 2 inches of movement instead of shooting that big old cannon, where little Tito, who could die to a stiff breeze, gets 6 activations. That's risky, but it's really powerful. It doesn't matter how many enemies you kill during the game, the only thing that matters is getting to those Moonstones, harvesting them, and then holding onto them and holding more than your opponent by the end of the game. And something like these ponds could make that just a little bit harder. I am very excited to see how this plays. Now I just gotta take this resin and plastic and turn it into some actual ponds. I started out priming my pieces in black. I gave everything 2 blasts, making sure to get this into all the nooks and crannies. And also I have an extra tree and some bits to sprinkle onto my ponds. Step 1, I want to tackle the rocks. I mixed some deep gray and black, and I did a quick and dirty base coat over each boulder. Then I turned the PSI way down on my airbrush and I splatter painted pure deep gray to start giving these stones some texture. Next I grabbed a slightly brighter gray, uniform gray, and I gave each rock a dry brushing to build up the value on the texture. And speaking of texture, another round of splatter painting with this color too. Then one more jump in value, ash gray. I gave my rocks another dry brushing, laying this on pretty thick as my final highlight. All of this stuff together gives some nice subtlety to my stone. With the rock complete, I grabbed some Brigadine Brown and I thinned this down so I can easily spread it all over the ground. This is the same color I used for the trees, but I need to first base coat over the gray that I spilled from the rocks. I reprimed the tree roots in black and then started dry brushing on the Brigadine Brown, leaving the black primer still showing in the recesses. Then to start brightening up my trees, I took Dryad Bark on a big old dry brush and I laid this on thick. After that, some Desert Yellow as my final dry brush on the top facing parts of my trees and fallen logs to make them bright. I took some Absolution Green and I mixed in a little bit of black to get a dark green color, and I airbrushed this over the leaves of the trees and all along the lily pads. Then I poured out what was left of my airbrush and I brushed this on as a base coat for all my tall grass and cattails surrounding my ponds. Once that base coat was on there, I dry brushed some Eternal Hunt onto the tops of my plants, and I'm dying to add the water effect, but first I need to finish the ground. Right now all my elements are painted nicely, but I want to add some natural chaos to make them feel real. And for that I grabbed some Dirty Down Moss. After so much shaking, I mixed this 50-50 with water and I slobbered this on randomly, covering most of the ground and some of my rocks and trees. I also picked this up onto my paintbrush and I used a toothpick to launch it off the bristles into splatter on the rocks. As it dries, Dirty Down Moss changes from a dark transparent green to a light, almost neon opaque green randomly, and this adds a lovely natural effect to the pond. The Dirty Down Moss is looking great. I don't get to use it nearly enough. I don't paint a lot of fantasy, but now I've got my ponds looking pretty good and I'm chomping at the bit to do the epoxy pour. But first I gotta figure out the actual water surface. I think a little airbrush gradient of black would look pretty good, but I have a little riverbed. This is a painting done by our artist Liqerise, who actually sculpted all of this terrain, and I think this is gonna be an easy way to add a little razzle dazzle to these pieces. I need this glued onto the inside of my ponds and under the resin. I cut out the pattern and then started trying to trim it up to match my random shapes. This was pretty challenging to eyeball, so I discovered that using tinfoil worked well to quickly crumple it into the right shape, and then I could transfer that onto my page and trace it out. This also had the added benefit of letting me be selective of what chunks of the artwork I want to use. I want this big fish guy front and center. Once I had my shape, I double checked it in position and made my final corrections that were needed. Then I flipped the piece upside down and I sprayed it with a little spray adhesive. This stuff is really tacky and holds down fast as I press down my pages. The artwork is looking really good and I actually used a lot of the same colors from a bit, so they match well. There are still some edits I want to make the artwork seamless. I took some Grim Black and I put this into my airbrush and then I sprayed this all along the boundary of my pond as a vignette so that the edge of my water looks dark and mysterious. Technically, they should be dark black in the middle and lighter around the edges of the pond. but I feel like it looks better this way, more magical, and it shows off my fish better. Now the artwork is down, I want to work on the bits that'll eventually live inside the water, these lily pads. I airbrushed on some neon green ink, each pad got a little puff in the center, and then I dry brushed these with some leafy green. I was considering gluing these down in place now, but I actually think putting these on after the water will be better. Lily pads are supposed to sit on the water surface, so I don't want to accidentally bury them underwater. I have this clear resin left over from when I was doing the rainy puddles on my Titan Stompy's base, and I have just enough for these two pieces. I mixed up equal parts A and B, and then I added some extra rocks and cattails. Then I poured in the resin. I only want a thin layer, maybe 1 or 2 millimeters. The depth will come from the artwork, I just need the resin to be a texture. I poured in a healthy dollop, so 75% of my inner pond had goo. Then I picked up the piece and tilted it back and forth so the resin flowed from edge to edge. Then I left them on my painting table. This is the only surface in my house that I trust is actually level. Then I went to bed. I let the epoxy set up overnight to cure, and so far so good. There's still a little bit of flex. They're definitely not fully cured. The instructions say it should take about a week for them to get fully hard, but right now they're pretty good. Definitely enough to keep going. The high gloss surface of that water looks really good, and it shows off that artwork underneath really nicely. It definitely needed that to really give these guys a little extra punchiness. But speaking of punchiness, there's a couple of more things I gotta punch up. I took some neon green into my airbrush and I dusted this over the plants to brighten them up. Just a skosh. I like my terrain to be a little dark, especially natural stuff like this forest. My miniatures tend to be bright and colorful, so darker terrain helps my minis pop. Then for my big ferns, I base coated these in sunburst ochre, and I threw these onto my cattails as well. Once that was dry, I washed them with a bit of darkwood speed paint, and then I gave them a final dry brushing of my original sunburst ochre. That's all the big stuff taken care of. Now just a couple of little decorations, like this creepy crawly climbing up the tree. I painted him with some reds and he's looking good and dangerous. Now everything is painted, I can finally do the assembly. These trees have a bunch of different branches and I picked out a few that I thought would look good and I glued them into position, using some little balls of green stuff to make sure I have a solid connection. That's my ponds all done. This is looking so good. This is a swamp. It's really surreal seeing this water feature, this little scale pond dropped onto my painting desk, and it really does look like there's a little pool of water, a little puddle, right here on the painting desk. Now, I might still play around a little bit with that water surface, but I want to give that resin a little more time to cure. So I'm going to set these guys aside, and in the meantime, I'm going to add a unit to my fairies that I have desperately needed pretty much for the whole time I've been playing Moonstone. In playing Moonstone, I have found the major weakness of fairies is the rule weakling. It makes them way worse at fighting and picking up moonstones. But this guy Wasp can fix that. I picked him up this year at Adepticon. He comes in the Shadowglade box. Typically, Moonstone minis are sold in these 3 model boxes. A small game of Moonstone is 3 minis, and a full-size game takes 6. Wasp has the spell Rage. He can cast it on any fairies to turn off weakling, meaning that my fairies that have tons of action points can use them all to the fullest. If I cast this on Little Tito, she will get 6 full-size activations in her turn. That could be a 4-inch jog, then 2 inches of step, digging up a Moonstone for 3, and then an extra inch of running away. Incredible. Moonstone fairies are some of the smallest minis I've ever worked on. They are all cast up in resin, and I washed the mini with my ultrasonic cleaner the week after Adepticon. Then he's been sitting unbuilt on my desk ever since. Now that I've read every Moonstone rule, this guy will be the linchpin of my force. I cleaned up every little flaw and imperfection with my hobby knife, and a fine sanding twig getting him perfect. It's also nice to spend some time with the figure, thinking about how I'm gonna paint him up later. Moonstone minis are all named characters with their own lore and backstory. Each guy has a unique painting challenge. Now to give him a base. I try to go pretty hard on the basing. I use some cork to fill in the slit the base came with. I could have just made this simple on myself, stick in my guy and add a little texture paste, but where's the fun in that? I added some rocks and leaves from the Deadly Swamp pack, and then I added some cork piles to the center of my mini's feet to stand on. I decided where Wasp would be located, and I drilled a hole for a 1mm brass rod pin. But before I stick him down, I want to coat the ground of my base in some milliput. I used a ball and its sculpting tool to get the putty to climb up the sides of my rocks and cork, and once I was happy with the shape, I covered the base in texture paste and then stuck down my mini. He's posed standing on some giant mushrooms, or maybe he's just really small, and then I added some more texture paste so that the mushroom had plenty of earth to sit on top of. Then I gave the model a black prime, then a zenithal of white ink from above, then a satin varnish to protect this ink layer. This zenithal is more of a light matte to help point my painting in the right direction. And speaking of direction, I want to follow the box art pretty closely. He's a very dark character, more of a warrior than the other fairies. I started out putting some terrestrial titan over his skin. Like any brooding warrior, he has purple skin. Then I started highlighting with alien purple, putting this over the top facing volumes of his skin, following the map the Zenithal made for me. Once the purple was on there, I started adding a little bit of ice yellow into my purple to make some highlight colors. I want this purple skin vibrant, so his warm yellow white will hopefully help my purple brighten without turning into a pastel purple color. I did 3 layers of highlights. He's such a tiny figure, this all came together pretty quick, and it didn't desaturate too much, but it does lack some vibrancy. He is a fairy after all, and I want him pretty obnoxious. Magenta has never let me down before. I took Wicked Pink and I glazed this very lightly over the purple to bring in a little intensity, and I did the same thing with Demonic Yellow to make my highlights more vibrant. That's his skin taken care of. He doesn't have much, the majority of the mini is his armor, and I really struggled to pick some colors that would stand out next to his purple skin. I landed on Tainted Garden and Blighted Green. I think these 2 colors will work as a non-metallic metal. I took the Tainted Garden and I painted this over all the parts of the mini that still had primer black on them. Then for the top facing parts of him, I mixed the dark and light colors together and I base coated the rest of the armor. This is definitely the ugly phase of the metal, but hopefully with enough fussin', it'll all come together. Once I had these 2 tones down, I took pure Tainted Garden and I glazed this on the intersections where my 2 base coats met. Then I mixed some ice yellow into this Tainted Garden for a highlight and I edge highlighted everything and I glazed this on the top facing parts. Now he's looking a little too desaturated for me. His armor needs a little warmth, so I took Sunburst Ochre and I glazed this very watered down to make his armor color more vibrant, and to make the transitions from green to brown a little less intense. After that, I reapplied my brightest highlights and his armor was looking pretty good. He kinda reminds me of the Arbiter from Halo. I glazed some Tainted Garden mixed with black over his wings, and then carefully layered on more and more white paint in this mix to brighten up his wings. Unlike the rest of my fairies, he doesn't have bright colorful wings, he's just got some normal bug wings. Once those were looking good, I finished up his spear with some Dryad bark on the handles and some Sunburst Ochre on the wraps. Wasp really doesn't have much going on, so I spent some serious quality time on what he's got. One of the things that keeps me coming back to Moonstone is that every character is its own unique guy. There's no battle line infantry or chaff units. Everyone is a whole entire unit in and of themselves, and so it makes it really enjoyable to just paint up a guy and know that I only ever have to paint this one Wasp. Where I might paint 3 Vindicator tanks or 2 squads of Vanguard veterans, I'll only have to paint this guy one time. I can enjoy the experience and then move on to the next project. Wasp is now very nearly complete, the linchpin of my fairies, and hopefully with this guy's help I'll actually be able to win some games with my little fairies. I think previously I've only ever won games of Moonstone with my goblins, but I really want to see if I can make the fairies work. For Wasp's base, I decided to go red for his toadstools. I used Basilisk Red watered down for the top of my mushrooms, then a glaze of pure red around the center. Then I made some little dots of ice yellow, a little bigger than I wanted the final dots to be. Once those were dry, I glazed on another watery coat of pure red to make my colors more saturated, and to turn my first layer of dots into pink dots. Then I did another layer of dots so that there was some subtle gradients to these markings. I think this mushroom in real life is poisonous, but I bet Wasp is immune. I glazed some more Dryad bark over the ground, and I used the last of my deep gray doing a watery base coat on my rocks so that some of that Zenithal is still showing through. I made up a wash of black paint to make my ground darker, and did a dry brushing of Dryad bark mixed with ice yellow for the ground. Then from a tall grass, which has the added benefit of making Wasp look even smaller, I glazed some Absolution Green for a base coat, and then highlights of Absolution Green mixed with ice yellow. Now everything is painted and I hit my mini with a satin varnish so I can do the last few touches. A watery coat of Dirty Down Moss to make my ground feel more natural, and then a few tiny 2mm Gamer Grass beige tufts. Finally, months after I bought him, I was painting the rim of the base black. Wasp is finally done and ready to lead my fairies to victory. Probably after a few practice games first. Another Moonstone mini added to the collection, and one that is actually 100% done. I have a really bad habit of not finishing Moonstone minis. Like everything in my collection needs like the base rim or a varnish or the grass tufts put on or the shoes finished. And I should just spend an evening knocking them all out. But what ends up happening is I start a new one and the cycle continues. But at least Wasp is 100% done. I have a really good time painting up Moonstone minis because I can go really hard on one singular figure, and then I can get back to my regularly scheduled army painting. And the terrain for Moonstone is very similar because it's a smaller board, and so I can get a lot more boutique with the terrain. And speaking of the boutique terrain, I got some more pieces to add to the collection. Compared to all my other terrain pieces, these little swamps are kinda sinister. They really give a nice vibe to this terrain. And at the top of the game, they can be decided on if they are water features or if they're just gonna be regular low walls. There are rules for low walls in Moonstone. You can make a jog action from one side of the wall to the other side, where if they're water features, Oh, that is gonna cost so much extra movement. They'd also be nice and usable in games of Warhammer 40,000. Although a little puddle of water is not going to slow down a Space Marine or an Orc, I would say that they could provide some cover. The Orcs are just taking a little splash under the water, and so the enemy is -1 to hit them. I think these pieces match my board really well. I might have to touch up the paint job on this mat that I've done and darken it just a smidge, and I wouldn't mind building a couple of more of these ponds, maybe a really big one. The resin and the plastic have not curled at all. I was a little worried about that, but they're perfect, and I could definitely use a couple more of these pieces. My Moonstone collection grows ever larger. Now that I got Wasp, my fairies are ready for action, and I do need to get working on the Cultists of Lish Vault. They're gonna be my next Moonstone faction, although I do own a smattering of miniatures, kind of from the whole range, and I'll eventually be expanding those out into full crews. Eventually I'll probably have the entire model range, but by then I'm hoping that this table is completely full of the most wonderful fantasy terrain this side of the Mississippi. The Deadly Swamps are available on EonsOfBattle.com, and now I gotta go decide what is the next Moonstone miniature that I'm gonna paint. Thanks for watching.